Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something that's frankly gonna blow your mind. We're looking at how some of the absolute hardest, most entrenched global problems have actually morphed into multi-billion-dollar market opportunities. We're pulling this straight from the incredible Soft Power Brief Q1 2026. And listen, this is going to totally rewire how you think about global challenges and the actual quantifiable financial weight of soft power. So I want you to ask yourself, is there a 1 billion-dollar market hiding inside a 1 billion-person problem? It's a super provocative hook, right? But asking that question fundamentally shifts how we look at traditional humanitarian crises. We're not just talking about endless charity drives, slow legacy grant cycles, or bloated government subsidies anymore. No, we're talking about massive, completely untapped markets where using soft power to fix a deeply rooted issue is literally becoming the most commercially rational thing you can do. Okay, let's dive into this. If we look back to 2025, the global aid architecture basically collapsed. Huge legacy donor systems, think of groups like USAID, they essentially withdrew or had to drastically pull back because of massive structural and fiscal constraints. And that left a gigantic structural vacancy in their wake. But here's the absolute critical piece to understand. The actual demand for those essential services, things like health, credit, and agriculture, that demand didn't just vanish when the funding dried up. What it did was expose a highly priced, highly quantifiable gap in the market. To really get this, you have to contrast how things used to work with the reality we're living in right now. The old aid model, it relied heavily on sovereign grants, it was completely bottlenecked by bureaucratic gatekeeping choke points, and honestly, the real-world outcomes were almost never measured effectively. But the new market model is a whole different ballgame. Delivery costs are absolutely plummeting. Capital is being tied directly to verifiable outcomes, and we're finally deploying commercial models to prove what actually gets the job done on the ground. Because you see, the underlying architecture of the market has completely transformed. The cost of delivery has just fallen off a cliff. I mean, AI inference costs are down 98%, and the cost of establishing a digital identity is now sitting at under $1 per person. And because we now have the ability to mathematically and digitally verify results, real capital can finally flow into these incredibly hard problem domains. Actually solving these issues is now a strictly commercial reality, which is entirely replacing the incredibly expensive, outdated model of just paying for good intentions. So to see exactly how this works out in the real world, we're going to walk through 5 unbelievable case studies. And we have to give credit where credit is due. These have been meticulously mapped out for us by global strategist Sophie Kranz. Her brilliant analytical work identified these 5 specific organizations. And spoiler alert for you all, these are not charities. They are highly defensible, incredibly lucrative market positions that are leveraging soft power in places where traditional hard power totally failed. Let's dig into the numbers. Let's start by slapping you with the sheer scale of our first opportunity. 400 million. That's the massive number of people across sub-Saharan Africa right now who have absolutely zero access to formal credit. Traditional finance entirely excludes them just because they lack a formal credit history. It's this massive, invisible economy that conventional banks completely ignore because they mistakenly assume it's just way too expensive to serve them. And this brilliantly illustrates what we're talking about, because a company called M-Kopa stepped right into that exact massive void. They realized that the lack of formal records wasn't a barrier, it was actually a product opportunity. So instead of requiring a credit history to give out a loan, M-Kopa makes the loan itself the mechanism for generating that credit history. By using pay-as-you-go solar systems and smartphones, they are turning everyday micropayments into a literal behavioral credit rail. They're building a usage-based financial identity for millions, transforming credit invisibles into a highly profitable investment-grade consumer segment. Now, I want you to imagine a total addressable market of 2.1 billion people. That is the staggering population currently living in active conflict and fragile zones. And in these zero-trust environments, traditional human observers just can't safely or quickly verify human rights abuses or coordinate early warnings. It creates this massive structural accountability gap where bad actors just operate with complete impunity. Well, enter Hala Systems, armed with an incredibly potent soft power asset, verifiable credibility. They entirely bypass the need for slow, highly vulnerable human observation. Instead, they deploy sensor networks and cryptographic provenance to lock in machine-verified evidence that literally holds up in international courts, even the International Criminal Court. They made the verification mechanism mathematical instead of reputational, completely sidestepping old institutional bottlenecks so they can save lives and establish legal accountability at the actual speed of modern conflict.
475 million. That is the sheer scale of smallholder farms that produce, and seriously, let this sink in for a second, more than 70% of the food calories in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Yet they operate at pure subsistence margins. Why? Because they lack access to bundled seeds, credit, and proper training. Legacy Aid treated this entire demographic as a permanent welfare problem, just tossing them fragmented, super inefficient, and agonizingly slow programs.
And this is precisely where One Acre Fund steps in with their specific soft power asset, which Krantz accurately labels the bundled promise. They replaced all that fragmented, wasteful aid overhead by engineering a single, bundled operating system for agricultural finance. They give farmers seeds, fertilizer, training, and group-based credit, all perfectly synced up with the seasonal harvest cycles. By linking their own financial survival directly to the success of the farmers, they achieve an insane 95% repayment rate. They prove smallholder farmers aren't unbankable at all. They just desperately needed better architecture than a disjointed charity handout. This next number shifts us to a tragedy, but crucially, a highly solvable one. 4.9 million. That's the number of preventable child deaths happening every single year, primarily because the delivery architecture of healthcare totally breaks down at the last mile. The clinics are just too far away, and relying on unpaid volunteer networks simply isn't consistent enough to deliver measurable, scalable care to these rural households. The status quo was just fundamentally broken. To fix that, you needed a totally different paradigm, and Living Goods delivered exactly that with their asset of actuarial legitimacy. Instead of leaning on unpaid volunteers, they professionalized and digitally supervised networks of community health workers. And by doing that, they were able to verify and literally price a unit of survival at exactly $3.09 per person per year. That is revolutionary, you guys. They turned public health from a blind, unmeasured budget allocation into a fully contractable market where governments can literally go in and purchase verified mortality reductions. Okay, our final massive market tackles complex social coordination on an unprecedented scale. 957 million people. That's the population across West and East Africa where you desperately need complex social coordination to drive collective norm changes. We're talking about moving away from harmful practices like female genital cutting and child marriage. Top-down bans and those classic awareness campaigns constantly failed because they completely ignored the massive social risk placed on a single family trying to act alone. An organization called Tostan figured this out by building what Sophie Krantz terms a proprietary social API. They basically serve as the last mile social infrastructure. They empower the community itself to become the delivery system for the change. By facilitating these collective, very public declarations of abandonment, Tostan completely removes that individual social risk. They make abandoning those harmful practices the lower cost, much safer social choice, which achieves sustained, massive behavioral change without relying on heavy-handed enforcement. Let's move to and see how this builds. To actually reverse engineer exactly how these 5 organizations built such massive, defensible successes, Sophie Krantz developed an incredibly powerful framework known as the 3 calculations. If you want to know if a hard problem can become a defensible market position, any leader absolutely must run these 3 specific tests on their model. You have the crossover point, the choke point map, and the voltage test. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the beauty of the crossover point. It isn't some abstract theory, it's a hard, undeniable mathematical threshold. It is the exact moment when the cost of delivering a structural solution finally drops below the compounding massive cost of maintaining the status quo. Once you hit this point, kind of like Living Goods proving they can save a life cheaper than the systemic cost of a preventable death, your solution becomes the undeniable, commercially rational choice. It mathematically proves your market viability. The second calculation you run is the choke point map. When you sit down and map out all the barriers to solving a problem, you have to be completely ruthless about distinguishing between what is a true structural constraint, like actual physics or core infrastructure, and what is merely an inherited legacy gatekeeping function. Exactly like we saw with M-KOPA bypassing those traditional credit scores. Identifying those false inherited barriers is what allows a smart founder to completely bypass the old bureaucratic choke points and build a vastly more efficient system. So the crucial point is the final calculation, the voltage test. This is where you test whether your model actually holds up in the brutal reality of the real world when the initial favorable conditions inevitably disappear. Does this thing survive without the founder micromanaging every detail? Does it survive without endless ongoing grant subsidies or preferential treatment? A true market position has to sustain and compound itself independently through its own underlying architecture and incentive structures, not through ongoing charity.
So we've seen the total collapse of the old aid architecture, right? And we've clearly seen how collapsing delivery costs and outcome-linked capital have opened up these massive structural vacancies all over the globe. As Sophie Kranz's brilliant research proves, the billion-dollar markets are quite literally already forming around these billion-person problems. So I have to leave you with this final thought. Are you going to use this framework to step into the structural vacancy left behind? Will you claim your own multi-billion-dollar solution? The opportunities are absolutely there, but only for those ready to act. Thanks for exploring this amazing research with me today on The Explainer.